So Laura talked about this like COVID-19, survive, thrive stuff. And I want to talk about a little bit what survive and thrive means, and then talk about patterns and models and how we think in those things, and then take one particular model and run with that a little bit because it's particularly relevant now. And then we'll open it up for questions. Sound good? Excellent.
Sounds
Thumbs up.
good.
Okay, great. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and you should see momentarily this list or this nice, pretty blue slide. And I have fully lost visibility to any of the important Zoom controls. So Laura and Jeff, if anything happens, you'll just have to interrupt me. But here we are. Survive and thrive is where we are right now. So I want to talk about what survive and thrive means. So when we're looking at the moment now, that's when we're talking about how we figure out how to survive. The pandemic has certainly brought into specific relief all of these changes that were already in play, as well as some that weren't before, that weren't already in play. So a lot of those changes look like social distancing, working from home, all that stuff was already in progress. It was already going on. And we just had this accelerated, vastly accelerated pace. One of the examples that I've used before is this idea of crossing the chasm, which for those of you who are familiar with the marketing of early stage products, that's the idea of that, like you go after your early adopters and you get all those early adopters. And then before you can go after like the early market stuff, like the late, not to mention the late market stuff, before you can go after them, there's this big chasm you have to jump across where you have to change how you're talking and thinking about your product to get from these really early adopters to this late market stuff. All the working from home, all the ways that we've socially distanced in the workplace and in our products have been in that early adopter phase. And what the pandemic basically did was kick us across that chasm. So now that we are all over here having to deal with all of these things. And so that's forced us all to kind of have to wrestle and wrap our arms around and unpack what this means and figure out how to transfer that just so that we can stay afloat. That's the survive part of it. And for some, that's been even more acute. Those who have had to close their doors temporarily or anything like that, where it's just not even a set of market forces, but just an unfair set of circumstances. So we talk about how do we go about this process of surviving. Then the second part of this is this thrive part of it. And this is really important because absent something like pandemic, there is always change going on, as I've alluded to. And there's always going to come a time where the survive is going to come into play. Every business has their moment, probably multiple times if you're a successful business, where you get a survive moment. And in order to prevent getting to that place, what you have to do is figure out how to be constantly thriving and constantly innovating. And I'll say by way of example that I would say you don't want to get Ubered. Like if you are, let's say the hack industry, and you're running taxi cabs or anything like that. If you aren't paying attention, somebody like Uber is going to come up from behind you, right, and disrupt that whole thing. You're taking that monopoly that you have in that marketplace and the way that things have always been done completely for granted, and that is cause for destruction. Right. So the difference between survive and thrive is actually not in what we're doing. It's the acuteness with which we're doing it. Survival is about like, we need to fix this right now so that I can pay my bills, right? That's survival. But long term, we're going to go through the exact same stuff in a slightly more relaxed manner so that we can continue to thrive. And the way that we do that is through this idea of business model innovation, which I do want to talk a little bit more about. Okay, so let's start with innovation. The basic idea of innovation is that it's three things and three things only. So innovation is either finding a way to create new value, increasing the cost of an existing offering, or decreasing the cost of providing an existing offering. So it's really important to understand that innovation is not the same thing as invention. When you're looking at an invention, that's a thing that we create, right? But an innovation may or may not have a new thing, but it always is creating value for somebody. It's a new product that you're offering to a customer to solve a particular problem that they're having. That is what innovation is. It's solving problems for people and creating value that you can then hopefully cash in for revenue, right? And it may or may not have an existing invention. And I'll talk more about that in a second. When you go and solve a new problem, or when you go and solve a problem in a new way for a customer, we call that creating new value. And that's the kind of innovation we think of when we're talking about early stage startups. It's the breaking innovation. It's doing things completely new. But ongoing, over time, there are those two other forms of innovation. So one of them is like, we have this existing thing out there, and now we need to do some product innovation to create more value and keep customers coming back, find new ways to serve them, add new features, whatever it is, right? To do all that to keep increasing the value of our offering. Maybe that means we charge more or capture more revenue out of that. Maybe it's just we don't bleed customers to the competition because we have these new features, even though we're not charging more money. It's still innovation. And the third way is finding a way to deliver that same value or comparable value by doing it cheaper, because then either you can capture that net as more revenue as more profit for you, or you can pass it on to the customer, or a mixture of both, or whatever. But innovation is always one of those three things. It's finding a way to create value, increasing value in something you're already offering, or decreasing the cost. So that's model number one of today. We're only going to talk about two models. Model number one is this thing. This is what innovation is. It's far simpler than we make it out to be. Okay. So the next thing is when we talk about how do we go about innovating. And absolutely everybody out there, including myself, I am very guilty of this. We'll say the exact same thing. In order to innovate, you got to think outside the box, right? And why do we say that? We say that you have to think outside the box because if you look at two big forces at play, one is called Einstein, which is a psychological thing, and path dependency, which is an economic thing. They tell us that it's way harder to do something different than what we've always been doing. Way hard to do it. We all know that that's intuitively true. And Einstein, it's like, if we encounter a problem, we're going to immediately look into our minds and look at the history of all the problems we've ever solved before, find the one that's most similar to it, and then try to solve that problem the exact same way. And we're faced with innovation, which is inherently doing new things. We can't always do that. We can't always try to solve it the same way. That we don't know that that's right anymore. So we have a psychological thing keeping us from doing that. The second thing is path dependency, which is very similar, but that operates on the scale of entire companies and entire economies. And basically, you can think about this as like, you're on a highway, you're going down, and you may think like, oh, you know what? It's going to be way better if we take that exit. We got to go off and take that exit. But taking the exit is hard. Not only do you have to decide to do it, you have to put the signal light on, and then turn the wheel, and probably take the cruise control off, and take your foot off the gas and brake over and do it. You have to do all these things that you weren't doing before. It's way easier to just sit there with maybe your hand on your lap and your thumb on the steering wheel, right? Because that's how most of us are all the time. It's way harder to shift literally everything to take that exit, even when we know it's the right move. So path dependency, Einstein, to keep us on the same path. We also have these other ways where we fixate on original use. And so when we look at something inside of our organization and we say, it's always been done this way, this is how it's done. And so therefore we aren't capable of thinking outside the box there. So we say, like, if somebody told you, how I want you to use this basketball to carry hot coals from here to there. Like, how do you, that doesn't make any sense. You can't use a basketball to carry hot coals from here to there. And I say, well, of course you can. Deflate the basketball and it becomes a bowl. But we fixate on the original use of what the basketball was for. Another example is I could hand you a candle and say, all right, I have this block of sticks. I want you to tie it together with this candle. You go, well, how do you can't tie a candle, it doesn't work. And so you think, well, a candle has a wick and a wick is a string, and you tie things with string. Take the string out of the candle and you can tie it together, right? So we get stuck on the original use of things. So it's much easier to just keep doing what we've always been doing. So we say you have to think outside the box. The problem with thinking outside the box is all that we're telling you is what not to do. We're not actually telling you what to do. We've just told you, like, don't do what you've always done. Well, thank you, helpful. Now what do we do, right? That doesn't tell us about that. So what do we have to do? Well, fortunately, research can help here, because if we look at the history of innovation from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution all the way through to today, and we look at all of the innovations that have happened, 90% of them involved nothing new. In 1906, 1904, somewhere in there, when King Camp Gillette created the disposable razor, right? Which is the idea that you had this razor unit that you would buy, and then you would replace the razor head on it on an ongoing basis. So the blade would wear out, but you keep the stick, right? And you keep replacing that. That was truly new for the most part. And so it was a brand new way of thinking about things. Instead of just selling this one expensive unit that somebody's going to keep for years and years and years and years, you have them buy a cheaper unit where they have to keep spending less money, but a lot more when you add it up over time on buying the individual razors. And we've called that the razors and blades model. That was something that was basically truly new. But it didn't stop there. That same pattern has been used a number of times to do other forms of innovation. Hewlett-Packard did the exact same thing with their inkjet printers. They created this printer, sold it relatively cheap, but you had to pay an arm and a leg for each of those cartridges when you ran out. Initial purchase, ongoing purchase, right? Razors and blades. When Apple created the iPod, they did not create the first MP3 player or the second or the third. What they did was offer an MP3 player with a store so that when you bought the initial unit, you would keep buying music on an ongoing basis. It's razors and blades. Same thing with your Amazon Prime subscription. Same thing with your Kindles, right? Same thing with the App Store on your phone. It's all the same thing. It's all razors and blades. None of them invented anything new as far as that's concerned. They simply reused other things. So the important lesson of this is it's not so much about trying to think outside the box, right? It's really about trying to find the right box in which to think. Because 90% of all innovation is just creative imitation. It's just finding something else that you from somewhere else and bringing into your world, into your industry, and making it work here. That's all the innovation is 90% of the time. And the key to doing that is being able to think inside models and patterns. So I'm going to talk about models and talk about patterns real quick, but the first, like the real model that I want to spend time with today is what we call the magic triangle, which looks like this. There are different formulations of it, but it's these 4 components. So at the center of any business model, of course, is the customer. Of course it is. If you don't have customers, you're done. Then we have these 3 things that tell how we're serving that customer, how we're delivering value to them. And we formulate these in these questions. So we have the value proposition, which is our what, we have the value chain, which is the how, and the why. Let's go. I'm going to go through this somewhat quickly because the point isn't the model, the point is thinking in models. So we start with the customer. This is actually figuring out who is our customer, what is the problem that they have, what are the expected gains that they're looking for, what are the pains that they're currently having, what tasks do they have to perform, right? This is absolutely why we are in business. We are in business because there's a dude out there with a problem that we're looking to solve. So they sit at the middle. Okay, then we have some value proposition that we're making to them. This is how we as a company are solving that problem for that customer. Straightforward. Then we have a way of delivering that value, of solving that problem to that customer. There are all these things that we have to do internally. If you're in manufacturing or you're creating a consumer packaged goods, CPG, as it's often called, or something like that, this also involves the whole manufacturing chain, right? Your whole supply chain that goes along with that. All of that is how you're ended up getting that value to the end customer. Internal, external resources, all of that to get it out to the door, right? There's that too. It's how we're doing it. Then the last one, which when you say business model, people just go straight to this. How does it make money? So if you walk up to somebody on the street and say, what's your business model? They say, oh, I sell blank. That's not a business model. That's a revenue model, right? The business model, again, has the customer too, but you have to make money. So then your revenue model is not just how much you're charging and how you're charging money, but how much it's costing you to deliver it. So like summarize all that up again. You have a customer for whom you're solving a problem, and that solution is your value proposition, right? You're getting it to them someplace. This is backward for you. You're getting to it somehow with the value chain, right? Across a value chain. And however much it costs to do that is less than how much you're charging for it, and therefore you make money. Winner, right? So this is what's called the magic triangle. And the reason we use it so much is because it is the simplest possible formulation of what exactly a business does. And it also allows us to overlay patterns on it, which I'm going to come back to in just a second. But to connect the dots all the way back to the beginning, when I talked about the 3 different kinds of innovation, this is why we talk about it. Because if you were to say, all right, I have this thing here and I want to go about changing how I'm delivering something. So I'm just going to, instead of getting it from this manufacturer, I'm going to manufacture it in-house, right? That's a product innovation. That could be a move to decrease cost, for example, right? By manufacturing in-house instead of out-of-house, or the reverse, right? Outsourcing it to China or to the Philippines or something like that. Maybe a way of cutting costs. You're not innovating on your business model. The business model is the same, but you have innovated, right? You found a way to decrease cost. Same thing by changing features and altering the value proposition a little bit. If you're serving the same customers the same way, but you've just changed the value proposition, you've again maybe increased the value of the offering, but you haven't done business model innovation. Business model innovation, the true stuff that keeps business alive, the way that you survive getting Ubered in the marketplace, is when you change at least 2 of them. At least 2 of these items have to change, at least 2 of the 4. So we're going to come right back to that in a minute, but we're going to take a temporary interlude to talk about why you'd want to change them at all. So I talked at the top about this idea of changes that are going to inevitably come in the life cycle of any business. They're going to cause us to go off the rails and then lose out to our competition. We call those change drivers. And anytime you have a pressure, it could be inside the company from a cost perspective. It could be outside the company from something like a global pandemic. But you have these changes that are coming in play that we have to react to. And there are lots more than we even keep our eye on. And I'm only going to spend like the last few minutes I'm going to spend talking about this. I'm really only going to focus on the ones that are related to the pandemic, but I do want everybody to walk away with knowing that this is not just about things like that. So here's an example. You have these large scale changes that could be, for example, a mega trend. One might be a regulatory shift. Right? And this could be like the law is changing, and so therefore our business model has to change, or the law may change, and so our business model has to change. It may be a cultural or social shift that's involved in something like that, about how we as a customer base are going to react to different things, how we perceive things. It's a psychological factor that goes in. That's a change driver that can leave you obliterated. There are resource shortages, right? So when you had the pandemic first start and all the social distancing start, and the grocery stores ran out of toilet paper and they ran out of flour and they ran out of all that stuff, that's a resource shortage, right? But it wasn't because there wasn't flour in the world. It was that supply chain that went to the grocery stores didn't have enough flour. But restaurants still had enough flour because those supply chains were actually completely different. And so the restaurants, some of them innovated and said, we have this supply chain that nobody else has access to, and people need this flour. So let's actually act as if we were a grocery store and sell that flour and yeast directly to the customers because they can't come into our restaurant anymore, right? That's a business model innovation. Same customer, completely different value proposition, completely different how, right? Because they changed two things. So there's those kinds of things that come into play as well. And there's also security related things. This would be the social distancing as an example. Where in order to feel safe, we are not gathering together in a tight group, we're keeping our distance, some like things are going to go on, etc. There are all kinds of change drivers that are outside of our control. They're all outside of our control, right? That are constantly coming in. And there's a whole series of questions that you can ask yourself to think about what are the changes that are going to impact me, right? Now, if we take that question and just put in the context of the pandemic, here's what those questions might look like. So starting with the who, in what ways are my customers either unable or finding it more difficult to engage my business? A flip side of that, by the way, might be in what ways are my customers finding it easier to engage with my business, right? That may actually be, it may be a positive thing. I've kind of framed these negatively because that's where most of us are, right? Or have been the last few months. But that's the question, is in what ways is it more difficult for them? Right? So that's the who. With the what aspects of my product do my customers find less or maybe even more valuable right now? That help you identify change drivers too. On the how side, in what ways is it more difficult to produce that product or deliver it to your customers? It's again, like you could have that grocery store saying, well, my supply chain doesn't have flour anymore, right? So it's more difficult. We have supply chain shortages. How do you get around that, right? So you understand those change drivers. Lastly, I'm leaving off the why for now, just for the sake of time. Okay, so once you have identified all of these change drivers, and by asking all of these great questions, right? And there are 100 more that you could easily come up with, right? But once you answer, like, here's everything that's changing around, you're going to figure out, when I look at my business model, when I look at these 4 pillars, I know exactly what's wrong. I know exactly what's broken in each spot. Then you can take a look at all of those patterns that I mentioned, right? The 90% of things that are all fitting into these patterns. You can take those patterns and compare them to your business model and say, okay, well, it's more difficult for my customer to engage me now because blank. But if I used this pattern, that would no longer be a thing. So can my business use that pattern, right? That's the basic question that we're asking. There are, and I will drop the link in a minute when I have the chat window back. There's a list of all 55 business models that are out there. Here are 12 that I used in a workshop that I ran a few weeks ago, because these are some that are most directly related to the pandemic and the change drivers that it has brought. But there are all these kinds of business model patterns. In this particular case, self-service is what it sounds like. Instead of somebody doing something for me, I'm doing it for myself, right? So it's a self-service model. So if you can't engage with somebody directly, maybe because of social distancing, how can you get them to do it on their own, right? What do you have to change in order to do that? Shop in shop is instead of running your own store, you can do like Apple and Google do, where you have a store inside Best Buy, right? They have a little aisle there, or the Entenmann's donut people, they have a display case at the end of the aisle, right? Shop in a shop. There's the ultimate luxury, where you say, okay, let's take the same thing, but let's target only the uber wealthy. Right? Or there is the target the poor, where you take the reverse of that and say, let's take this offering and figure out how we can only target the poorer people. And there are lots of ways to achieve those types of things. There's two-sided markets, where you're just sitting in between a buyer and a seller, right? There's e-commerce is an obvious one. Instead of selling in person, let's try to sell online, right? There is, oh, you know what? I was selling in these stores, but now people can't go into these stores. So instead I'm going to sell directly to people. And maybe that's online, maybe it's not. Et cetera. And we talked about razors and blades. So there are 55 of these, and here are just 12, and I only talked about half of them, right? So there's all these business models, and they're not exclusive, right? So you can see how some of these would combine together, but all of these imply things about the who, the what, the why, and the how, right? And they all imply things about some of those components. So what you can do is take that list of 55 things, take your documented business model, take the change drivers that you've pointed at it and say, I can't do this anymore. And you look at these business model patterns and say, but that pattern here could do that. So what would it look like to take that pattern and overlay it on top? So if I was to switch to e-commerce, then my what changes from getting inside stores to doing a thing. So I have to set up a website, do that. Well, my customers want to do a website, right? And so you go through all of those things and say, is this a feasible option? I'm going to talk about how you make that decision in just a sec. But that's the basic mechanism of this. That's it. By thinking in a model, by thinking about oversimplifying to this is the thing that we're talking about. And then by coupling that with patterns, in this example, these business model patterns, I say, here's how things look. Here's how other models work in other industries. You can take those two things together, overlay them on top of each other, and very rapidly, literally come up with dozens of potential hypotheses, of potential new things to try that you can then go about exploring. The ideas are the easy part. If you can think in a model and you can think in patterns, the rest of it becomes relatively easy. Okay. To wrap up, couple of things. Once you actually come up with this set of hypotheses, you have to go through the process of evaluating them. And because we are the startup SAC community here, a lot of us are familiar with lean and all of that. And so let's say you came up with this idea for this e-store. Should you just go out and build it? Most of us would be like, we probably don't want to just jump into this, like, let's build a whole big thing. That's kind of not lean. That doesn't make sense, maybe. So how do you go about doing that? So here's two tools that are actually the same tool, just slightly rebranded, that you can use to do that. So first is, let's say you went through all these patterns. You went through the 55 patterns. And again, I'll drop that link in the Zoom chat in a moment. If you go through all these 55 patterns and you come up with a set of, say, 10, 15 hypotheses that seem like maybe they'll work, right? How do you go about doing them? Well, the first thing is you have to rank those. So you have to figure, if you use this tool to filter from 10 or 15 down to 1. And that may be difficult to do. And most of us are going to be like, let's do a gut check on this. And a gut check is fine. But the way to do a gut check well is to structure it a little bit. And here's one way to structure it. So this way here is with feasibility versus importance, right? So the way to think about this, feasibility is how hard would it be to do? And this is just like a gut check. It's licking your finger and sticking it in the wind of the golf course and saying, like, this is easier or harder than that, right? How feasible is it to approach that process? Importance is a kind of a gut measure of how important, like relative to all of the other options, is that one. And that could be like, this has the most revenue potential, and so that's what's important to me. Or it could be about hedging our bets, and so we want to make sure that we give our customers a reason to stay, and so maybe something more about that. It's less about the revenue than it is about losing customers, right, in the short term. There could be a number of different things depending on your business, which is why we have this general, like, importance thing. But if you take all of those things and you literally, like, draw this thing on your wall and write those on sticky notes and literally just slap them onto the wall, right, where they are, what you're doing is saying that, like, we have some things that are not very feasible, not very important, right, or whatever, some things that are really important but not really feasible, some things that are really feasible but not at all important, and you're looking for the one business model hypothesis that's up here, the one that you yanked out that makes the most sense up here. And you may have a couple up there, and if you do, that's great. Grab one. You're just picking to run with it for a few days. So now you have one hypothesis. I'm going to add e-commerce into my mix, right? One hypothesis. Now it's time to say, okay, even within that, even though I've narrowed it down to one idea, I still don't want to go out and build the whole thing. So you have to start by thinking about what are all of the assumptions that you're making in this model. Some of them are extremely explicit and others are extremely implicit. So this is a set of questions, for example, that you can use that to juice out from your hypothesis all of the assumptions. You just ask these questions and come up with answers to them to come up with a list of probably dozens of hypotheses that you're just guessing on, and that you may be more likely to be right or less likely to be right, but you're still largely just saying I'm guessing on it. So for example, what assumption do you have of your customers need? So when you're moving e-commerce right into the mix here in in-person store, the one assumption that you might be making is that they still have a need for the product. It's not just about the in-person thing, that they still have a need for the product, and you may be confident in that, but it's still an assumption, right? So you got to document that. Each one of these questions, you should be able to come up with 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 maybe different assumptions. You want to get as many as possible because any one of those assumptions could sink you. So you document the heck out of all of them, right? And some of them are like, what assumptions do you have about your revenue model, right? So again, this is cost versus revenue, right? So like, can you do that cheaply? Like building this whole online store, well, that takes effort, right? My assumption is that I'm going to get the revenue sufficient to cover that, right? That's one example. Whatever the play is, every single assumption, get 30 of them. And then once you have all of those, now you're going to go through the process of actually ranking them. And so we have, again, a very similar tool, but this one is not a gut check. This one's real. So we're going to go through the same process. Again, you'd like draw this on your wall somehow, and then you take all those assumptions, 30 of them, write them down all in sticky notes. You can do that digitally too. I've never found a tool that's amazing for it. Sticky notes are the shit. But you write down on sticky notes like all these assumptions, and you start graphing them on here. I'm going to give you an example real quick. So if you are, say, making an e-commerce play, and you're going to do that by way of a mobile app, something like that. And so you've noticed that if you, so if you're like a really well-established company, right, you can change the color or the size of your buy now button. And you could get like a 0.5% lift in conversion just by changing that, right? And like, that's amazing, because if you're doing 30 million in revenue, a 0.5% lift is actually pretty freaking good. That's some sweet stuff. But that's not where you are right now, right? So it's super uncertain where the position and everything is. And some point it may matter, but it does not at all matter now. Really uncertain, but not at all impactful. It is not going to change anything. On the flip side, you could have something like, oh, well, people actually have to shop online. That's my assumption, is that people need to that people shop online. If you're wrong about that, you're sunk, right? You're done, because that's like the whole thing. So it's really impactful, but for most audiences, for most customers, that's not at all uncertain. Everybody shops online, right? There are exceptions to that. But just in considering like a standard B2C play with your average customer, like they shop online, they shop on their phones, like that. We just do that, right? So hugely impactful, but not at all uncertain. So you'd slap that sticky note right here. But there are some things that are really impactful and really uncertain. These are the things that it's like, it makes sense, but I don't know if it's right. And if I'm wrong, I'm done, right? Like this idea is done. You want to find out what those ideas are. And again, like this is a measure of, when we're talking about uncertainty and we're talking about impact, we're not talking about a target, right? A target implies a bullseye, and there are no bullseyes in life. What we're looking for is the direction to walk. We're not trying to hit a target. We're not trying to hit the side of a barn. We're lucky to hit the field, right? But what we're doing by saying like, I want to explore this idea of e-commerce and the blah, 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 what we're doing is not establishing a goal and endpoint with these features that we're going to hire somebody to like go build right away. We're not there yet. What we're doing is picking the direction to walk. And what that means is that I don't know what right is. It might be here, might be here, might be here, but I do know it's not here, right? You're excluding all of the other ways. You think about like a Pac-Man, right? I don't know if I can do this on Zoom. Do like a Pac-Man, like I want to walk in that direction, which means all of the other stuff in that circle is wrong. The Zoom window is way too small for that illustration. That works better in front of a crowd. I should have had a slide for the Pac-Man. But anyway, you're picking a direction to walk. And so we're talking about uncertainty. It's like, how uncertain am I that this is true, and how impactful is it going to be if I'm wrong walking in this particular direction? And so you're going to come up, this is what's truly just based on your business and based on what you know, based on data, based on how uncertain is it really. Don't go with your gut. Do you have data out there to support that this is real or not? right? Do you have data to support that this could sink you or not? Like, where are you in that? Come up with the ones that are really pure, and those are the ones that you want to test. And the way that you do that is going to be dependent on exactly what the hypothesis is. But this is where now you have an hypothesis. You can bust out all those lean startup tools that you already know and love, landing pages and customer surveys and blah, 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 blah. You can create all of that stuff to now answer one question. So you've gone from, I don't know what to do, to here are all these patterns. Let me filter through the patterns. I've come up with some that maybe make a little sense because they kind of solve that change driver that I'm looking at. Then you look at which one's feasible and important to me. Okay, that one looks interesting. Now with that one, what's all the stuff I don't know about that? Oh, okay, I don't know all this stuff. And you know what, if I'm wrong about that, I'm really done. So let's take a look at that and let's figure out a way to test that. And that's how you get through this kind of process. And this is something you should be doing all the time in the good times, always looking at what are the change drivers? How do I get ahead of them? Because if you're not doing it, your competition is, and then you get Ubered. So I went through all of that faster than I ordinarily do and still took more time than I wanted, but and it's about a half hour. So I'm gonna go ahead and kill it there. And I would love to spend time on Q&A. Did I lose everybody with my 1.75 podcast speed that I was speaking at right there? Okay.
So Josh, would you like me to assist you?
Yes, please.
The hands raised feature in Zoom. If you go down to move your cursor to the bottom of your screen and you click on the thing that says participants, there's a little icon, blue icon for raising your hand if you'd like to ask Josh a question, and that way we'll maintain a little bit of order. So we'll open it up for some questions.
Cool, and I will, Laura, do we have a way if I want to just like throw these slides into a picture to send out? Is that something?
Yeah, I can share this slide deck if you send it to me with everyone who registered.
Cool. And then I'm going to give this link here. You don't need to go exploring it right now.
By the way, we're also recording this, so we've got this on video that we'll figure out a way to share that with at least those who are on this call.
Okay, so we have a couple hands raised. Jeff Sakala, why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Hey, Josh, it's Jeff Sakala from Studio Co-working.
Hey.
So my question is, with so much uncertainty and we're trying to innovate our business model, my concern is making a big decision that maybe sends the business in the wrong direction and kind of accelerates the failure.
Yeah.
How, I guess, what would be your response to that, or how would we deal with, things changing so rapidly that you make a decision this week and you head down this path, but then things change again and you're sunk because you've invested so much time and effort into changing your business model or trying to innovate?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you're totally right. And I think the solution to that is to not invest so much time and energy. And like this is again, that difference between survive and thrive. Because when you're in survive, sometimes you just gotta like, you know what, I'm gonna roll the dice and take my chances. We're gonna see where we end up, because what else am I gonna do, right? Like I know with a co-working space, like if, for example, if you had to close for 3 months, I don't even know how a business survives, like something like that. Like that's just awful. So like sometimes you just have to like go all in on something else because the alternative is also awful. But outside of those kinds of things, when you're kind of doing this routinely, what you want to be doing is decreasing the risk, what we call derisking. And the startup way that you de-risk is oftentimes called customer validation, but it's all about de-risking. And the way that you de-risk is by identifying those riskiest assumptions and finding the cheapest possible way to test them. And so this is where like the MVP concept comes into play, right? Minimum viable product. So what is the smallest possible thing that I can build that could answer that question? And then getting to those answers as quickly as possible and cheaply as quickly as translates to cheaply. Getting those answers, questions as quickly and cheaply as possible, and then rotating through that cycle so you're always building on something. That way, when going back to the example of like walking in the right direction, you're going to take one step and say, am I on the right path? No, okay, one more step. Am I on the right path now? Yes. Okay. Let's take another step in this direction. And you keep going through that process, and you're going to go on that usual startup journey, right, to get someplace. And you're going to end up where you want to be, if there's a there at all. And that's assuming that you pick the right direction to walk in. But this is all the usual startup stuff like pivot or persevere. All of that comes into play. But it's all about the same thing. It's about finding the ways to de-risk as much as is humanly possible. Get all the risk out of that. Really juice those assumptions to find out where your riskiest parts are, and then finding the cheapest possible way to test that, and then constantly be looking at, is this the right market opportunity for me? There's another, like I said, thinking in models. There are tons of models. Like what I have this whole box of tools that I reach into, and like the magic triangle is one of them. But another one is like there's a tool called the Market Opportunity Navigator, which is also great. This is another way to kind of go down this same process with a little bit of work. And that's where you look at what are all of the internal capabilities that I have, and what are some other opportunities to deploy those capabilities, and those all generate potential opportunities, and you evaluate those and figure out that. So there's all these kind of models and tools that you could use to try to figure out if you're walking in the right direction. But de-risking is the biggest answer to that.
Thank you.
Sure. You're muted, Laura.
Paul, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thanks. Yeah, and Laura, I had that same thought this week, that Uber had been surprised the way they surprised the taxi industry. Surprise, you're going out of business now. So that was really good, Josh. What I'm getting from customers is, I mean, it is kind of as bad as it is a good time to replan. And I think people are replanning, and I think part of replanning is taking a step back, like you suggest, just kind of getting the eraser and thinking all over again. It looks like Mindbox has kind of consultants all over the place, and it doesn't have to be you, but does your organization have a good one or two good kind of stories or case studies, especially given the recent environment, like somebody you've worked with that you applied literally that process that you just described, and kind of what was the thing that kind of turned their thinking or made a difference?
Yeah. So right now there's a lot that's sort of in flux, right? And you don't get the kinds of like really long-term successes, like those kinds of stories inside 2 months. You get things that are kind of interesting and kind of promising, and like that kind of worked out well. But as far as like inside the pandemic, this is like, it's a window that's too narrow to see outcomes. But on a much broader level, like this same process, absolutely. So one of them that I would choose to share, I'll try to be brief about this, is we're working with a custom manufacturer, and they were looking at a constantly changing demographic. And so they were like, okay, so we have this changing demographic. They don't want to do things the way that we're doing. They can't afford to do it that way. And so like, how do we go about this process? And we went through the identification of some market opportunities, like where the change drivers are coming in there, where the customers getting younger, blah, blah, blah. They're also, the customer itself is also getting smaller, right? So instead of serving like big organizations, they're getting smaller. So they're smaller and they're younger. They don't want to buy the way that we're selling. And they are also like, they can't afford to buy what we're selling. And so we go through this process where after we juiced out some assumptions, we came up with, it's not actually that they can't afford to buy what they're selling. It's that they can't afford to subsidize the sales and marketing process, because inside that custom engineering required a lot of like an engineer, like to literally go and do some stuff. And they couldn't afford that for the size of these companies. So you take those two changes together, like the change in the customer and the change in the how there, right, in the delivery mechanism, and we injected e-commerce into that along with a couple of other patterns. So essentially, was the question that we asked the marketplace was, can we develop an e-commerce experience where one of these new customers, where they do want to, because they're younger, they want to interact with it this way, can go online, go in and design what it is that they need in the browser with no previous engineering or design background, get something that drops onto the factory floor, that gets produced, shipped out to them to do some macro assembly at the end, and deliver them the value, right? Can we do that kind of thing? And the answer is yes. And so they're testing and running with that, and also targeting, like they're getting their competition to also be customers, which is amazing. So it's that kind of thing.
Great, thank you.
So,
Brendan?
Yeah, so I just had a kind of broad question. Do you think that there are any fundamental differences pivoting right now for professional services businesses or startups compared to those that sell a physical product?
Yes. So there are, I mean, it's actually, let me rewind.
Specifically in terms of models, I mean, I realize it depends.
Yes. When in terms of the models, the answer is no. In terms of like which patterns to come into play, then the answer is of course yes. And so like, so we're largely a service business, and so we went through the same thing. We have a lot of experience doing events online, and so we've done them for years and years, and but we've constantly like sold this value proposition of in person. Like we come together in a room with your team and do this greatness, and then suddenly that marketing language got ripped from our hands a few months ago. They're like, we had this experience that we didn't talk about because we were specifically selling this value proposition of like how we do this. So we didn't have to do business model innovation because what we were doing still worked, but we did have to change the value proposition. We did have to tweak that a bit to kind of adapt for something like that. And that was just based on this idea that we have this change driver coming in, the security change driver that's causing people to not want to get into a room together. And we've specifically told people the value of being in a room with other people. So we've had to go through that same process and kind of done through that. But the process itself is fundamentally similar. This works with CPG, like consumer packaged goods. It works with service businesses. It works with SaaS and any other like traditional high tech startups. It's all the same stuff. All you're doing is putting yourself into a model, looking at how it's changing, figuring out how you can react to those changes to generate hypotheses, and then taking those hypotheses and figuring out how to test them. So service business or not, it's still the same process. Different patterns though.
Thanks.
Most of the time.
And we have seen some service businesses, like there's a young man in Folsom who started a service called Delivery or Deliverly, which is for the real small shops. It's not for restaurants, but small stores that want to be able to deliver to customers without using one of the bigger guys. And then there's a startup in Woodland called Niche, which is a way for in-person stores or brick and mortar stores to let people to respond to requests from consumers on products they're looking for. So we're seeing some of those things just really gain more traction and interest. Brendan has another question, I think.
Yeah, I figured I'd just follow the process. Yeah, and I guess this could be a question for anyone also. What's the new way to network right now, since that's also usually an in-person thing?
I would actually love to hear everybody else's answers to this. So I'm gonna dodge the question and answer it at the same time. And the way to do this is say that like this is a great when you're when we're looking at a question like that, the best possible thing you can do is to step back and say, like, what is the outcome that we're trying to achieve? The networking that we do in person isn't really the outcome we're trying to achieve, right? There's something else that's trying to happen there. And so we can make this mistake, which we oftentimes do. It's human nature. It's the Einstein effect all over again, right? Where we try to solve it the same way we've always done something else. I cook a lot. And so the big problem with vegetarian food, right? I'm not a vegetarian, but like the big problem with vegetarian food is that they try to like say, oh, we need to replace the steak. So let's replace it with a mushroom, right? And they're like, that doesn't work. Like, I mean, it might be fine, but it's not going to be like it was before. And that's because you can't just find something to swap out the meat with. What you have to do is say, what are we trying to achieve? Well, that meat is trying to do these things. It gives umami, it gives texture, it gives blah, blah, blah. It gives all these things. So you find alternatives for that in the vegetarian side, and maybe like 5 or 6 different things, not replacing one-to-one, replacing with 5 things. And then you get that in place. So like the question I would ask you is like, what is the outcome you're trying to achieve from that? And how else might you get that same outcome? But now I'm going to shut up and let everybody else answer.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to add that the Sacramento Beer JS group, JavaScript group, next week, I think it's next Friday, they're going to have their monthly meeting using a virtual reality platform that you're supposed to be able to walk around and talk to people, whatever. I'm not into JavaScript, but I might just attend that meeting to see how that platform works. I think that could be cool.
There's also some other platforms that are evolving and coming out these days that aren't such an immersive thing as virtual reality, but kind of a 2D avatar thing where you can walk around a room and walk up to somebody and start initiating a chat or a online video conversation with. So I'm actually going to be exploring some of those things coming up in the next few weeks. But if anybody's used any of those, let me know. I'd be interested to hear how it went.
Yeah. And how have other people been meeting other people and expanding their relationship base?
You know, even though I asked the question, I realize now that I stumbled onto something. I've been watching a lot of streamers on Twitch, and they're all plugged into these into Discord servers. And Discord is just a program basically that it's hard to describe. Hacker Lab had one set up for a while, but it's basically like a personal server / forum. And you can set up different channels inside of it with different topics. Anyway, that seems to be a really, really common way. If you're someone who is on YouTube or who does video things with a community, you try to get people into your Discord server during your downtimes to stay connected. And so it hasn't been for business, but I've met a lot of new people that way.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I'm going to post the meeting link to the Beer.js meetup if anyone wants to join just to check it out there.
You're in the park cooking.
Yeah. I don't see any hands raised. So Josh, I kind of have a question. There's sort of been two stages, I think, to this pandemic, and I'm sure there's more to come. But, you know, the first stage was, this is temporary, a month at most, you know, where everything's going to be open again. And now there's something of a new normal where we're expecting, you know, people are starting to go to restaurants and stores and things like that. But the idea of going to a concert or going to a business event, you know, I think it's going to take a while before people feel comfortable doing that. So I guess my point is that there's like, this thing keeps changing. It's like there might be some things that you had to do to survive the first 1 or 2 months, but and there was a lot of uncertainty. Now there's still uncertainty, but there's this trend that we're starting to identify that, you know, a lot of people don't want to go to stuff. So people who make their livelihood in entertainment or, for example, organizing business showcase type events. TechCrunch is going to be, Disrupt is going to be all online this year. You know, will people pay for that? That sort of thing. Anyway, I think there's a question in there somewhere. So why don't you find it and give us an answer?
I'm going to pretend the question was, so how do businesses operate in that uncertainty? And so I agree with everything you just said. And as much as people have gotten annoyed with this concept of the new normal, right? And we're not at the new normal yet, right? The normal is still shifting, which is really important. And it's also really important to understand, and I'm going to say this, and I know that everybody knows it, but it deserves being said again. We might get another wave in the fall. There's always another disease on the horizon, whether it's this year, next year, 10 years from now. Globalization is the reason that we had the pandemic the way that we did. Okay, and the world is not going back. We are in a globalized world now, and that is what it is. And you can try to fight against that all you want, but you're going to be on the losing side of history. Like this is where we are. And in some ways we're going to relax and things are going to settle down, but global supply chains aren't going anywhere. Global business isn't going anywhere. And so a lot of these types of things and many, many others are going to keep coming back and keep disrupting us. So the most dangerous thing that any business can do is right now is to settle back into complacency. We I'm going to speak as Americans now, we were complacent before this pandemic. We did not have to deal with what other countries had already had to deal with. And a lot of the world was in the same position we were, but we had grown increasingly complacent with something like that. And now we just got a big wake-up call. We cannot go back. We cannot afford to go back to that same place of complacency. We need to be better prepared. That's the policy side of things, right? We need to be better prepared and have better policy prescriptions, be able to respond sooner. All that stuff is very true. But as business owners, we have to be much more durable. We have to be able to survive those kinds of things. We can't be so fragile anymore. And that's constant. And there are always going to be these, like what insurance companies would call acts of God, right? They come along and kind of destroy everything, and there's nothing you can do about it. And how do you see it coming? Is what it is. But there are these other things that we can see coming, or that we should see coming, and that we can constantly be hedging our bet against, and having these little, as a business, a little side project that we can use to try to hedge against, like putting all our eggs in one proverbial basket. And we don't know what next month is going to look like, or the following month's going to look like, and we have to not pretend like we do. We don't know when those concerts are coming back. We just don't. We don't know when we're going to have restaurants full again. And like the biggest problem with, which you alluded to, Laura, like with this idea of like, let's just open up the economy. We need to get America working and open up the economy. Whether that's right or wrong in like principle, there's this implicit assumption as soon as we open it, the doors are going to be open, and everybody's going to flood in, and businesses are all going to be packed again. And that's foolhardy, because people are still afraid. And like, so some of those things are going to change. And if you don't believe me on that, ask yourself when the next time you're going to feel comfortable shaking someone's hand is. We may have just witnessed this year the death of the handshake. And it was already on its way out. Let's not kid ourselves about that either. But we may have witnessed the death of the handshake.
So Brendan has another question.
Yeah. Oh, hold on a second. It just escaped me. Yeah. Okay, I remembered it. Just because I looked at the time, I wanted to ask if, on the topic of networking, could we all just go around and take 5 seconds to say what we're each doing? Just in terms of businesses, right? Like we shared our LinkedIn's, but can we just...
Let's save that for a minute, Brendan. We'll do it at the end, but we're recording, so we kind of want Josh to wrap up, and then we can open it up for that. Does that sound good?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So we are at the top of the hour, a couple minutes past. Josh, do you have any sage words of wisdom you'd like to close this out with?
Well, that put me on the spot, didn't it? Okay, so
give us some stupid advice.
Oh, there we go. I can do that. No problem. So the best advice that I can give is again to avoid complacency and always be looking at change drivers and how you're going to react to them. And whether or not you use these tools here or a number of the other tools that are out there, your own mixture of things, constantly, especially in good times, be looking out for the things that could get you Ubered. Right? And they're going to be hard to find, which is why we go through these tools and processes like to try to juice them out. But keep a lookout for those change drivers, how they're going to impact you and how you could possibly react to them, and then stay ahead of the market on those things. Get involved with those, test some hypotheses, see, oh, that's interesting, right? Then you become the default one. You become the Uber, right? That nobody wants to be the Lyft, right? And nobody certainly wants to be anybody who tries after that. So get ahead of the market on all of those things. The last thing that I would do is if anybody wants to reach out to me, I'm going to drop my email address in the chat here. I know a lot of people have had to go already, but there's my email address. If anybody wants to reach out to me, definitely, open to any of that. My LinkedIn was also there and in the thing. You can connect with me. If you email me, I can put you on our mailing list. We have a bunch of stuff that's coming up soon. Mindbox mailing list. A bunch of stuff that's coming up soon. We're going to have an online course launching soon that covers a lot of this stuff and kind of walks you through how to do this in a much more specific, at your own pace kind of way. So that kind of stuff, you want to be interested. If you're interested in anything like that, hit me up, let me know. Or if you just want to talk about what's going on with your organization and all of that, feel free to hit me up.